Hello, my name's Louise Wilkinson and I'm Professor of Medieval Studies at the University of Lincoln, and for the last 20 years or so I've been working on Eleanor de Montfort, the wife of Simon, Earl of Leicester, and in my talk I discussed her early life and career and her role during the Barons' War, drawing heavily on her household role, which I published with the Pipe Roll Society in 2020. In her own day, Eleanor de Montfort was probably one of the most famous and important women in England. Yet today, there's still remarkably few people who've actually heard of her. And yet her poor historical reputation has long been overshadowed by that of her husband, Simon de Montfort, Earl of Leicester. But she was a woman in her own right who was phenomenally well connected. She was a close kinswoman of not one, not two, but three English kings. She was the youngest daughter of King John, shown on this slide on his tomb in Worcester. She was also the youngest full-blood sister of King Henry III and the aunt of King Edward I, or the Lord Edward. Eleanor's mother, Isabella of Angoulême, was also incredibly well connected, and like her daughter, is perhaps one of England's lesser well-known medieval women. Isabella was in her own right a kinswoman of the kings of France through her mother Alice's courtly connections. And Isabella was also a very important French heiress through her father to the whole of the county of Angoulême. But King John excluded his wife Isabella from a role in English politics and government. He gave her very few independent resources and effectively prevented her from emerging as a political figure during his reign. So today in my talk, I want to take you through then Eleanor's early life and career and talk about her role particularly during the Second Barons' War, when her husband, Earl Simon, famously held King Henry III captive between May 1264 and August 1265, if we've heard from David. Now, in Eleanor's case, we're very lucky because the sources for studying her life are incredibly rich and plentiful. She's mentioned in the monastic annals of the age, she's mentioned in the chantry rolls, the government records of Henry III's reign. We also have some very interesting charters and letters, and we're especially blessed because we have a truly remarkable set of household accounts that survive to the year 1265. And these are one of the earliest private household accounts to survive in England. There are about perhaps a dozen or so that are earlier, and they tell us about this momentous year, and they're my favourite thing. So first of all, let us look at Eleanor's early life and her family. So she was one of the 5 surviving children born to King John and Isabella of Angoulême. Her older brothers were, of course, the King Henry, who was born in 1207, Richard of Cornwall, who was born in 1209, her elder sister Joan, who became a Queen of Scots, who was born in 1210, her other sister Isabella, who went on to become a Holy Roman Empress in the 1230s. She was born in 1214, and then there was Eleanor, who was probably born in either 1215 or 1216. No one actually recorded the moment of her birth for posterity. All we have is a chance reference in the history of the Dukes of Normandy, which tells us that in 1216, the Queen was pregnant with a daughter when the King died, and that daughter was probably Eleanor. Now, unfortunately, King John's death from dysentery at Newark on the night of the 18th and 19th of October 1216, followed by Eleanor's mother Isabella's decision to return to France in 1217, meant that the royal children were effectively orphaned at a very early age. And Eleanor was placed, along with King Henry, in the care of this man, Peter de Roche, Bishop of Winchester. And in reality, the royal children had separate households, and we know from the pipe rolls, the account rolls of the bishopric of Winchester, that she spent some of her early infancy on the bishop's manor of Taunton, and by the 1220s, she was also possibly placed in the care of Robert de Courtenay, one of her mother Isabella's English kinsmen. But unfortunately, the political fragility of the English crown in this period meant that the marriages of Henry III's sisters were seen as incredibly valuable political assets, as tools in the king's diplomatic armoury. And so Eleanor's marriage was probably arranged by 1221, and she was married in 1224 at the age of 8. Now, for those of us in the audience, the good news is that it doesn't appear that she actually lived with her husband until perhaps 1229, when she was 13, and presumably had reached an age where she might bear children, although it would have been incredibly risky. It was incredibly unusual for an English princess to marry an English earl, and her new husband was William Marshal Jr., Earl of Pembroke, one of the greatest magnates in England, Wales, and Ireland. And so Henry III, because this was such an unusual match, had to actually write to his proctors at the papal curia to justify his decision to marry off his younger sister to an English lord. And he explained that William Marshal Jr., whose shield's shown upside down here, was a tremendously important man. He performed important services for the English crown, and Henry was also rather worried that he might form a marital alliance perhaps with Scotland or France. And he also explained that the French king habitually married off his kinswoman to subjects as well, which is quite a fun justification, and probably quite a valid one as it happens. Now, Eleanor's first marriage did not last very long, because William Marshal Jr. died in 1231, leaving her a widow in her mid-teens. And his death transformed her into a potentially incredibly wealthy widow. So she was entitled, for instance, to 10.5 manors, which she'd received as a marriage portion from her brother in 1229, and a third share of the Marshal's extensive estates. The problem was, though, that her Marshal in-laws didn't want to honour Eleanor's dower rights as William Marshal Jr.'s widow. And so she encountered difficulties in securing her Marshal properties, and eventually had to agree to the payment of a £400 annuity to cover part of her Welsh and Irish dower, which was probably well below its true value. Henry, though, was not indifferent to Eleanor's plight, and in 1237 he did grant her the castle of Odiham, which is shown on this map. And during her second marriage, he'd also grant her Kenilworth, which was just up the road. Now, after William Marshal Jr.'s death, Eleanor as a young woman came heavily under the influence of her governess, Cecily of Sandford, a woman whom Matthew Paris described as a pious, noble and learned lady. And under Cecily's influence, Eleanor took a vow of chastity and perpetual widowhood. And this was a vow that Eleanor came to later regret, certainly by her early 20s. She became flattered by the attentions of Simon de Montfort, who was then a royal councillor and a claimant to the earldom of Leicester. Eleanor and Simon decided to marry. They sought the support of King Henry III, who gave it to them, but the king then presided over a secret marriage ceremony recorded in the Chronica Majora of Matthew Paris, which took place in a private chapel just off the King's chambers in the Palace of Westminster in 1238. And there was a bit of a problem with this marriage, because Henry III, in consenting to this clandestine union, had thoroughly failed to consult his magnates. When news leaked out, there was a rebellion led none other than by Richard of Cornwall, Eleanor's older brother, and this had to be quickly quashed. So why did Eleanor then marry? Why did she turn her back on a life of chastity? Well, Matthew Paris tells us, quite simply, she wanted to become a mother. And with Simon, become a mother, as you can see from all these children, she most certainly did. The couple had 6 children who survived infancy. Henry, Simon, Amory, Guy, Richard, and little Eleanor, who was probably the last child, who was born in 1258. The trouble was, though, that Simon and Eleanor's relationship with Henry III, as most of you will know, was far from smooth. In August 1239, the couple were effectively expelled from court and had to enter a period of exile, after Earl Simon had imprudently named Henry III as a surety for a debt without first asking the king's permission. Henry also rounded upon the couple and accused Simon of seducing Eleanor, although it's very difficult to know if this was indeed the case. And I don't think there's any question that there was any sexual impropriety before they married, certainly not one that resulted in a child anyway, because the dates for her children don't quite match an earlier seduction. Anyway, Eleanor and Simon then effectively spent most of the period up until about 1243 out of England. Simon, as we heard from Sophie, went on crusades, and they then returned and gradually sort of rebuilt their relationship properly with Henry III. Unfortunately for the couple, due to the odd circumstances of their union, due to the ongoing legacy of Eleanor's dower rights in the Marshal estates, and due to some incredibly high expenses that Simon incurred during a lieutenancy period in Gascony in the late 1240s, they were dogged by indebtedness. In addition to this, fluctuations in royal favour on the part of Henry III also threatened their security quite severely. And this may have impacted upon the couple's personal relationships. And we're fortunate for the period from the 1240s through to the 1250s in that we have some remarkable correspondence surviving, written by a mutual friend of theirs, the Franciscan friar Adam Marsh. And within his letters, he counselled the couple at times on their personal relationship. And I think he suggests to us in his letters that they had quite a tempestuous, passionate, and quarrelsome relationship at times. So this is an extract from what is one of my favourite letters of Marsh's, written to Eleanor in 1249 to 50, in which he counsels her on the dangers of anger. So imagine what she must have been like to have incurred this censure from the pen of this friar. Anger is the source of quarrels, mental disturbance, insult, shouting, indignation, faint-heartedness, and blasphemy. Necessarily, these are followed by sadness, leading to malice, rancour, despair. Forgive me, I beg you, for not having restrained my pen from harsh reproof, or rather from salutary advice out of my anxiety. And he did write to actually sort of saying, you know, I'm getting worrying reports about your behaviour from people. I wonder if she inherited her personality from her father, King John. Anyway, that's idle speculation. I think these letters do give us some really interesting insights, though, into what was going on in the Montfort's household. Now, by the 1250s, Eleanor and Simon were becoming increasingly dissatisfied with Henry III's personal rule. But Eleanor in this period, interestingly, still traded on her relationship with the king when it was most useful for her. And she actually bore the royal arms of England, and on her seal, on her counter seal, she was the sister of the King of England. Now, it wasn't just the Montforts who, of course, became disillusioned with Henry's rule during this period. Henry III's court, as we heard from David, was one of factional rivalry, especially after the arrival in 1247 of his Lusignan half-kin. And so in England, as you all know, in the 1250s, a baronial movement arose to reform the English realm, to reform royal government in response to Henry III's poor policy decisions, the competition over patronage, and indeed the pressures of royal government that were passed down to the localities. Simon de Montfort famously became one of the 7 magnates who marched on the king in April 1258 and who made Henry III agree to reform the English realm. Through the provisions of Oxford, which are noted in an extract on this slide, and the provisions of Westminster, a system of conciliar government was imposed on the king, and the executive functions of power were taken from his hands. Henry III, as we know, didn't really want to observe these provisions, and over the years that followed, the relationship between the two sides broke down irrevocably, leading in short to the outbreak of the Second Barons' War. So 1264 saw an initial royalist victory at Northampton, followed by a decisive Montfortian victory at the Battle of Lewes on the 14th of May 1264, which resulted in Henry III and Lord Edward, Richard of Cornwall and his sons passing into Montfortian custody or captivity. And I've been to Lewes on a number of occasions over the years, and one of my favourite things I've ever done was to actually unveil the Battle of Lewes tapestry at Lewes Castle, which the good needlewomen of Lewes had stitched for the great anniversary celebrations in 2014. So perhaps there should be a big Evesham one, if there isn't one already. And it was a lovely experience because I gave a lecture to them all on needlework, which was a new departure for me. But they were all dressed in 13th century dress, and they were just so lovely and warm and welcoming. And they explained all the different 13th century tapestry techniques that they'd used. So yes, they should all get some Heritage Lottery funding and get one here. And they could do a tapestry tour. Anyway, and that would be a nice feminine angle to it all, won't it, as well? So, with the Queen overseas then, Eleanor de Montfort became preeminent in status among the women who remained in England. The Montforts in the period after Lewes famously enriched their family, and they kept Eleanor's royal kinsman in close custody. And 1265, the year that followed, was a truly momentous one for Eleanor and her family. It began with Montfort keeping court at Kenilworth, riding high on his fortunes, and of course it ended quite brutally with Simon dead and Eleanor in exile. And we get a fantastic insight into the events of this year in Eleanor's beautiful household roll for 1265. Medievalists had a slightly different view of beauty to the rest of it. This is Eleanor's beautiful household roll, which is now in the British Library, preserved probably in the nunnery, where she sort of spent her last days in exile in France, rediscovered in the 19th century. So I'll introduce you first of all to Eleanor's household roll. It survives in 13 membranes, and it covers the period on the front from the 19th of February through to the 29th of August. It takes the form of a diet account. So for every day, it tells us the day, who was with Eleanor, where she was, and what the household consumed. And then we have interspersed lovely things like spice accounts, accounts for greyhounds, and so on. Then on the doors, which I haven't got such glamorous pictures of, we have a wardrobe journal, which covers the period down to the 1st of October. And the wardrobe journal is an incredible treasure trove of entries. So we've got messenger accounts, all sorts of random accounts for the purchase of cloth, for the payments of archers, for the purchase of all sorts of household essentials, including a cat to keep the mice away at Odiham. It's just absolutely wonderful. And it allows us some quite close and interesting insights into Montfortian affairs in 1265. It tells us an awful lot about Eleanor's own role as Simon's lady in promoting and safeguarding the Montfortian regime's interests in those areas where she resided. So in the early spring, she spent her time at this place, Odiham in Hampshire, which was a very fine hunting lodge built from 1207 onwards by King John in stone. And he spent probably about £1,100 on his construction work there. And this was the castle that Henry III had given Eleanor, in which she sort of eventually raised some of her family. And we know from entries on Eleanor's household roll that she played a key role in supporting Simon's regime during this period, fostering contacts with important local lords and ladies, entertaining numerous visitors, and also sending gifts of nice wine to local allies. And she really came into her own as one of the most important political hostesses in England in this period. And we can see this from a lovely family conference that was held at Odiham in March 1265. So Early in 1265, there was the famous Hilary Parliament, which discussed all sorts of momentous business, including the possible relaxation of the Lord Edward's custody. As soon as that Parliament dispersed, guess where they all went? Odiham, arriving there just a few days later. And in Eleanor's household roll, we can see the arrival of the Lord Edward with one of Richard of Cornwall's sons, and the number of horses in Eleanor's stable rose from 44 to 172, so it was a substantial party. And you'll note they also had to hurriedly buy 1,000 new dishes. And then 2 days later, who else arrived? Earl Simon himself. And they all dined together. And again, note the number of horses. By this occasion, they've risen to 334. So perhaps Eleanor then was the great hostess at a great gathering which continued the business of that Parliament, and which perhaps was intended to put on a political show of unity, however potentially insincere it was. Note though the quality of the diet during this period. You'll note it's all fish. This is because it was during Lent, so we don't get flesh on the menu, but we have pike, which was the fish equivalent of venison, a very high status deluxe fish in this period. And note the use of almonds to give it a bit of flavour. Isn't that wonderful? And you can see, if you go through carefully Eleanor's household roll and calculate the amount of bread corn that was used, you can see potentially how many people were with her, although this table comes with all sorts of caveats about it might not be at all accurate, because I had to use a formula that Chris Walgar, who's very good, a professor in Southampton, gave me, which was based on sort of figures from other household accounts. But it does show that in that March period, the 17th, 18th, 19th of March, there were lots of people with Eleanor potentially at Odiham and Earl Simon. Now, Eleanor's life at Odiham continued fairly uneventfully throughout the spring. She entertained local figures, including the Countess of Oxford, Robert de Vere's wife, whom Sophie mentioned. But affairs soon changed, unfortunately, very much for the worse. Because on the 28th of May, the Lord Edward escaped from Montfortian custody at Hereford, which was 110 miles away from Odiham. And of course, this led to renewed royalist activity across the whole of the West and the Marches. In Eleanor's household roll, we get a really incredibly interesting insight into the impact that this had on Eleanor and her great household when news reached her. It shows us that the Montfortians completely panicked. So we know from the account roll that Simon's messengers reached Odiham probably by late in the day on the 30th of May, or at least on the 31st of May. Eleanor was then joined pretty much instantly by one of her sons, Simon Jr., and she made immediate plans to flee from Odiham to a much better fortified residence, Portchester Castle on the Hampshire coast. And in Eleanor's household account roll, actually I should just flip back quickly, we see that she travelled by night to Portchester, so she really felt under pressure. And Dobby the Parker was paid 10pence to escort her. And she actually brought in and borrowed coaches, carts and horses from neighbouring religious houses and lords and ladies, so that she could escort her household in a panicked way as quickly as possible. So she reached Portchester, covering perhaps up to 42 miles in one day, and was much safer there for the time being. Portchester was held by Simon Jr., her younger son as constable, and it was very well defended by land and sea. And you can still go and visit it today. It's a fantastic site. Once at Portchester, Simon Jr. and Eleanor gathered their supporters. So the horses there with her rose from numbering in the high 40s into the 80s. And on her last day in residence at Portchester, she may have fed as many as 381 people. There was just a mass of people who came in to join her. She then left Portchester. She'd left it by the 12th of June and she travelled across the whole of the south coast to Dover. And she arrived in Dover 3 days later, having travelled by a meticulously planned, if hurriedly planned, route. which seems to have been designed to ensure her safety and to ensure that she gathered as much support for the Montfortians as possible. So on the 12th, we know she ate at Chichester, whose bishop was a Montfortian supporter. She spent the next night at Bramber, which is that rather sad keep on the side there, which was a Brioux family residence that was then in Montfortian custody. She then spent the night of the 13th at Wilmington, presumably at the Priory on the bottom side there. Then she travelled on the 14th to Battle. She was a benefactor of Battle Abbey, so it made sense for her to stop in Sussex there. And then on the 15th, she travelled on to Romney, had lunch there, and went on to one of my favourite castles in the whole of England. I used to take my students there a lot when I was in Canterbury, Dover. And Eleanor, during her great progress, covered about 30 miles a day. So quite a fair whack for a great household. Now, Dover was a much, much more secure fortress even than Portchester in this period. It looks out and still looks out over the straits of the English Channel. On a clear day, it's very easy to see France. And it had undergone extensive rebuilding work earlier in Henry III's reign, especially after the Great Siege of 1216. So in Henry III's reign, a brilliant new constable's gateway, which is this structure just here, had been built, as well as lots of other sort of improvements to the curtain walls, new buildings called Arthur's Hall, a series of chambers, chapels and kitchens. So it really was an incredibly superior residence. Henry's building work on Dover Castle was more than he spent on any other English castle, I think, during his reign. He spent about £8,000. And of course, Dover's constable was her eldest son, Henry, although he wasn't then in residence. And so Eleanor used Henry's stores on her arrival to make good any shortfall in provisions, and she sequestered or borrowed 2 tons of red wine, which she then sort of made a note that she had to sort of pay him back for in her accounts, or her officials did. The acting constable of Dover at the time was a man called John de la Haye, a very loyal Montfortian who had estates in Sussex, Kent, Northamptonshire, Gloucester and Lincolnshire. When she arrived in Dover, pressure on the accommodation there was so great that initially only the sort of countess and her women were accommodated in the castle. This was certainly the case on the 15th of June. On the next night, things settled down a little, and Eleanor and her followers of baronial and knightly status were accommodated on the castle site, but everyone else was sort of still relegated to the port and town of Dover, presumably fending for themselves to a degree. Now, news of Eleanor's arrival in the locality spread incredibly quickly, and she carefully courted local allies. And you get a sense of this, actually, if again you tot up the figures in her account roll, as well as looking at the individual entries, because her diet account shows us that her average daily expenditure, which you can see here, rose to well over £1. And we know from individual entries that she did some very prudent entertaining in this period, including entertaining the burgesses of the Cinque Ports. So the burgesses of Sandwich were entertained on Wednesday, the 17th of June, and they shared a rather lovely meal with her that included plaice, breams, soles, and other fish. And the Cinque Ports were, of course, famously local allies of the Montfortians. But as we know, royalist fortunes continued to rise in the marches, and the Battle of Evesham on the 4th of August 1265 was an absolute all-out disaster for Eleanor and her family. She lost Earl Simon, she lost her eldest son Henry, another son Guy was taken captive. Hence the murder of Evesham description in one of the chronicles of the period. And in Eleanor's household roll, we get some insights into what happened to her next. And I always find them terribly sad. So this is a sad bit of my talk. So in Eleanor's household roll, we have perhaps her last documented contact with Earl Simon before he died. And this was when she sent Sling away to the Earl on the Feast of St. Peter with 2 shillings to cover his expenses. Sling away was one of their regular messengers. He disappears from her role after this entry. I don't think he got out of Evesham alive. So I'm going, this is my first trip to Evesham. And the disaster can be traced on her role in other ways too, which are incredibly sobering. So the events were so devastating that visitors to Dover in this period completely dried up, which was really odd compared with all the other entries. And there seems to have been a delay in the news even reaching Dover, or at least being confirmed there. So if you look at her diet account for the 4th to the 10th of August, Dover seems to have followed its usual pattern of life, with the Countess eating in the Great Hall, eating her usual diet, but with fewer visitors. But then on the 11th of August, you get these entries, which seems to suggest that news has reached Dover and it's been confirmed. So first of all, Eleanor seems to have sent a messenger, the master of the Mason Jew God's house at Dover, to the king. And you can only imagine what was in that message. Can I have my husband's body? What have you done to him? Where's my son? Is Guy safe? Are you going to let him out? You know. And then you also get on the diet account this entry, which shows that Eleanor has withdrawn from eating in the Great Hall in front of her household, presumably to undergo a period of mourning. And suddenly the whole garrison are being brought in to dine with her great household, presumably as a show of togetherness. And the garrison then continue to eat with Dover in the days that follow, with Eleanor's household in the days that follow. And what's really, really interesting is if you have a look at the physical makeup of the roll at this point, for the accounts that cover the period from the 7th to 10th of August, which are probably written up a week or two afterwards, the physical appearance of the roll changes quite a lot. And you get this scrappy bit of parchment that's only 17 centimetres in length inserted, where all the other accounts are written out very tidily on lengths of 30, 40, 50, centimetres. And you also get a new clerk coming in to write up this account. So it's really quite sobering stuff when you look at it up close. So Simon's death at Evesham then firmly placed the spotlight on poor Eleanor. And what did she do? She was a good mother and she looked to the safety of her surviving children. And she was very lucky because the loyalty of the Cinque Ports held firm. So she was able to contribute towards assuring that her youngest son, Richard, came safely to Dover via the port of Winchelsea with the help of 100 mariners. And he reached Dover in August, and immediately on his arrival, he was given some black robes as his mourning garb. Then, a little over a month later, she was able to smuggle him overseas to France with another son of hers, the clerical son Amory, and 11,000 marks in cash. So they got away with their mother's help. Simon Jr., we know, who was still out and about, was certainly back in touch with his mother by the 14th of August, and he remained at large. And Eleanor was in reasonably frequent contact with him. Then, around the 15th of August, she received a messenger from the Lord Edward himself, and judging from her accounts, that message may have provoked a degree of panic at Dover, because she hastily paid for a new furnace to be constructed, for new masons to be appointed, and it looks very much like she went to work on improving the castle's defences in earnest. In this period, her level of daily expenditure went down, probably because so much cash was being shipped overseas, and also because she was now in financially straitened circumstances. Her local sources of supply seem to have dried up in this period, and so Eleanor's household resorted to plundering the neighbouring countryside for its supplies, whereas in the past, she shipped them in from some of her Kent manors like Brabourne. But this was no longer possible as the royalists began to overrun Kent. So you get some quite sobering stuff here. Now, there was a brief respite for Eleanor, which came with the September Parliament, which opened at Winchester. And we know from her household role that she probably sent a delegation to that Parliament. But the trouble was this Parliament made a terrible decision for the remaining Montfortians, because it decided that all who'd been with Henry III at Northampton, at Lewes and Evesham, all who'd been against Henry III at Northampton, Lewes and Evesham, should henceforth be disinherited. So this was catastrophic news for the remaining Montfortians. And sadly for Eleanor, early in October 1265, the royalist prisoners who were being held in Dover Castle decided to mount an escape attempt, possibly with some help from inside. And the chronicler Thomas Wicks tells us that news of this escape attempt reached the Lord Edward, and that he literally flew on horseback down from London to Dover and mounted a siege, which according to Wicks was quite short-lived. To us, though, it looks as though Eleanor probably was involved quite early on in negotiating a deal with the Lord Edward, who actually described Eleanor in some letters he wrote at this time, perhaps a little hypocritically, as his very dearest aunt. But anyway, on the 26th of October, Eleanor was able to negotiate a deal whereby 27 of her associates at Dover, who were within her great household, were allowed to return to the king's grace and favour and go free. And actually, if you trace their fortunes, those who didn't rebel again did get their lands back. Then, on the same day, Henry III invested his younger son Edmund with the estates of Simon de Montfort. How must she have felt? 2 days later, Eleanor left Dover and travelled across the Channel with her daughter into French exile. And she remained in France until her death in 1275. Eventually entering a Dominican convent at Montargis, which had been founded by a Montfort sister-in-law of hers. But in exile, Eleanor was on occasion reunited with her surviving children, thank goodness. So we know that in February 1266, Simon Jr. escaped from England through the port of good old Winchelsea. Guy, his brother, then also escaped overseas in the spring. And according to the Dunstable annalists, where did they go? They went to their mother. And confirmation of this comes in the form of a copy of some letters that were issued by Eleanor in December 1266 from her residence in France, to which she has the seals of 2 of her sons and her daughter attached, which was later copied into a manuscript now in the Bibliothèque Nationale. Now, sadly, poor old Richard, Eleanor's youngest son, does not seem to have lived much beyond 1266, and he disappears from our records, having fought for the Count of Navarre. Eleanor, though, continued in her widowhood, her second widowhood, to fight for her lands and rights in England with mixed success. But in 1267, Henry III agreed to pay her £500 per annum, provided she remained in exile. So you should never misjudge a younger sister. Edward I seems to have confirmed these arrangements in his reign, and in 1275, Eleanor finally passed away. And here is a copy of her Inquisition post-mortem, a survey of her remaining English lands, which survives in the National Archives. Again, not looking too glamorous as documents go. But it does show us that she was in possession of some of her Marshal estates in this period, which had actually been administered by officials on her behalf, the estates at Kemsing and Newbury. And that ties in with what we know from other sources. What of Eleanor's poor children? There they all are across the screen. Well, they had rather sad fates. Guy and Simon Jr. famously took part in Charles of Anjou's Italian and Sicilian conquests. They were given Italian estates and offices. Guy married an Italian heiress, but then they committed a great crime. In 1271, in March that year, they brutally murdered the eldest son of Richard of Cornwall, Henry of Almaine, in the church at Viterbo, causing an international outcry. Simon died soon afterwards, and Guy was eventually imprisoned. Little Eleanor, of course, famously set out in 1275 to marry her betrothed, Llewellyn of Griffith, the Welsh prince, only to be captured along with her brother Amory by Edward I's men. She was then held in captivity until she was allowed to marry in 1278, and poor Amory was held till 1282. So Eleanor's household role then is really something rather special because it shows us how much the Montfortians' fortunes changed during those dramatic months in 1265 and really set that poor family on a path to destruction. The end.